Hey, everybody. I'm so glad you're with us today. We have a fascinating topic to tackle, and I'm just going to read the title of this new study out on the news, and you'll get an idea about where we're going. Caught in a Dangerous World, Problematic News Consumption and its Relationship to Mental and Physical Ill-Being. At Smarter News, one of the things that we talk about is building a solution in news. And in order to build a solution in news, we have to talk a lot about the problem. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And one of the problems that I've seen in the news industry from the inside, but also as a consumer, is that news is just hard. It isn't easy to get the news. That's the number one question I've always received as a journalist. Where do you go to get the news? Because people just want the news. They just want to know what's happening. They don't want all the arguments, the aggravation, the partisanship. And there's a feeling that's attached to news delivery right now. And I would think that this has actually been over the last several years. That's really negative. Watching the news seems like a loaded proposition rather than something that you just do to get the news and then move on with your life. And so with Smarter News, that's one of the things that we've tried to do: quick, concise, nonpartisan information. We'll give you the stories so then you can get on living your story, which is what we want to help support. Because if we support you with good, nonpartisan information, then you feel informed and then you can go about your day. I mean, that's what we want for you, is more freedom, more liberty to do that. So when I saw this study, I reached right out to the team because I had to understand more about what they learned. And we're really lucky today because Professor Bryan McLaughlin is with us here from Texas Tech University. He is the lead author of this study. Professor McLaughlin, is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
And so tell me, how did you even decide to tackle this topic? I'm sure there's a million topics in media that you could tackle. Why problematic news?
Well, the short answer is personal experience. But
I'm gonna write that down. We're gonna have to come back to that. Yes, personal experience, but go ahead.
I've been studying political polarization for a little while now. And I started getting interested in political narratives, and particularly the way that people can kind of get drawn into these narratives and what you see on news shows, particularly partisan news outlets, and how people get drawn in. And I kind of equated this to how people can get drawn into like a movie or a book. You get so sucked in, even though maybe you're not directly experiencing it, you're feeling like you're there. You get really emotionally invested. And so you kind of get transported into what's happening in the news. And so I've been kind of working on that for a few years. And then a couple of years ago, I started kind of developing a bad relationship with the news myself, where I was just always looking on Twitter all the time and just getting really stressed out about where things are going in the country, all the conflict, and just kind of wondering where this is all heading. And I started to just kind of have trouble sleeping, getting back pain, just feeling stressed all the time. And I kind of started to realize, like, this is not really going well for me. This isn't particularly healthy. I kind of quit cold turkey for a little bit. I've come back to the news, but I kind of started to evaluate that and kind of understand that. And that kind of was the kernel that kind of led to this process. Then I started talking with Melissa Gottlieb, my colleague, and we kind of developed the idea. And then we brought in our colleague, Devin Mills, who specializes in addiction sciences. And together we kind of conceptualized this and kind of really drew it out and thought about, what does this look like? And what are the kind of criteria we can kind of think about?
Well, thanks for sharing all that background. How long did it take for you, someone who is well aware of political polarization, as you mentioned, in society, to connect the dots and say, you know what, actually, I think this back pain that maybe I thought was lifting groceries actually might be related to bad sleep because I'm on Twitter too late at night, reading all these different news stories that I otherwise may not have in front of me?
Um, I mean, it's hard to say. I've been following the news for a while, and I kind of go through periods, ups and downs, where I get more or less sucked in. But it wasn't really until kind of a couple of years ago that it started to kind of connect to me. And what you can notice is, things like cortisol rising. When you get stressed out and you kind of feel like, you can feel your body kind of carrying all that stress. And so I think it took a little while for me to kind of get there. But as I was like kind of dealing with back pain and kind of trying to figure out the causes and stuff, I started kind of paying attention to the things that were stressing me out and the relationship between that stress and just kind of having issues, just being, as comfortable going through my day-to-day life as I would like to be.
Absolutely. So how did you even start thinking about how to study it? Because thinking about it is one thing, but putting together a study that you did and actually having to define problematic news consumption, which may look differently to different people. Yeah. How did you approach it?
Yeah, that was probably the hardest part in all of this. Like it, and when we talk about this idea, it seems pretty intuitive to most people, like that they can see, oh yeah, people can have some negative effects from if they're addicted to the news. But kind of with my co-authors, we started looking at addiction literature on obsessive compulsive disorders, problematic video game relationships, problematic social media relationships, and just kind of looked what they were all using, right? And there's kind of a set of criteria that's typically used for things like addictions. We didn't think all of them applied to news use. Things like tolerance, where you have to take more and more of a substance to get the same effect, doesn't seem as applicable because you don't need more news to get the effect. It's just more of a kind of, you can't stop watching it because you're so caught up in it, right? And then withdrawal, you don't usually, if you have a substance, you feel that kind of need to get it back into your system. But with news, actually, I think a lot of people, they immediately feel better if they decide to take a break from it. So we kind of figured that maybe those don't work, but we adopted some of the other ones and kind of adapted them a little bit to the news context, and put a little more emphasis on the absorption component, the way that people get drawn into the news, so that it feels so real and present to them.
So these are a couple of different categories you had in your study: transportation, preoccupation, misregulation, underregulation, interference. These are a few. And I found myself sort of describing people in my own mind to match these more clinical definitions. And maybe I'm wrong. So we'll do this together, Professor McLaughlin. We'll see. This is our own experiment. So transportation. So transportation would be someone that literally feels like they've been transported into a news story, that they feel so impacted by the news story. It's almost like they could feel it. They could feel being there. And that then leaves a lingering effect, that transportation of them into a news story. Would that be a way to describe this person that feels so connected to the news? It's almost like they were there.
Right. And so I think a good way to kind of think about it is like if you go to the movie theater, right? And you watch the movie and you're just in that world, you're in that narrative, and then it's over and you step out and you're like, okay, I'm at the movie theater again, right? And you kind of snap back and you realize, okay, the things going around you. When you're in the narrative, you kind of lose awareness of that, right? You're so just drawn into it, you're just experiencing it as if it's here and now. And we think that can happen with the news, that people can get so sucked into it, that's really all their mind can focus on, and it feels so immediately present. It feels like they're things they're experiencing directly, even though maybe they never will actually experience the things that are, some of the things that are on the news.
I'm sure our audience is starting to think about people. It's always easy to think about other people, by the way. Oh, yeah, that person.
Right.
Preoccupation is another category that sort of feels tied to transportation. Preoccupation, someone that's thinking about a news story, and it's even if the news story ends, the topic or the feeling that the topic has produced is something that they just can't stop thinking about.
Correct. Yeah, it's just that kind of constant thinking about it, right? And so you're always having these thoughts and you kind of get sucked into them. And another kind of analogies you can think about, when you're driving and you get somewhere you didn't realize you were there, that you were driving at all.
Mhm.
You drive because you're thinking about something. Well, it's when people get sucked into the news thoughts, right? They just are thinking about things and they might imagine kind of worst case scenarios. I think this is maybe one of the more problematic things that we tend to do, which is, what if this happens, right? And then we get so worked up about these potential negative outcomes. We get really frightened by it or angry about it, and they may or may not happen, but we're kind of putting the cart ahead of the horse sometimes.
What about this term misregulation and underregulation? Can you walk us through those two?
Sure. So misregulation is the idea that, well, people kind of develop compulsive habits, but one of the reasons they do is because they think it's going to help, right? And so a lot of people, they kind of get stressed from the news, and they think the solution is to consume more news, because if they're anxious about something, they want to know more. They want to either find good news or at least feel like they're informed and they know what's going to happen so they can be prepared for it. And so this kind of compulsive habit to, okay, I'm feeling a little bit bad. What can I do? I can turn to the news, thinking it might help, thinking it might make you feel better, but it usually doesn't, right? The news usually gives us some information that maybe makes us feel a little worse. And then the underregulation means just the kind of inability to kind of regulate your behavior, to stop yourself from compulsively checking. And this is when you're just always doing it all the time.
I'm really fascinated with this topic of misregulation. I read a book this summer that was a little bit about addiction. It tied into media addiction. And one of the things the author was talking about, it's called Dopamine Nation, in case anyone's interested in that, was talking about how when there are certain addictions, people don't realize that they have addictive behavior. So let's say, for example, you think you're relaxing by looking at social media and reading the news, and then you find out that maybe it's upsetting to you, or maybe you stumble upon something that you don't necessarily want to see, and you might put down your phone, but then, a little while later, you're going to come right back to it because you actually think it's helping you. Oh no, I'm going to go relax. I'm going to go read Instagram again. That's like a way for me to check out, veg out for my day. And you're not connecting that it's actually provoking you in a way that's actually negative. And so you're trying to do the right thing. You think you're doing the right thing, when in fact you're doing the exact thing that's making you upset in the first place. And I never really thought about that, Professor McLaughlin, because especially with the news, if someone wants more information, if it's curiosity that's driving it, I think, great, cool, find out more information on any given topic. So how do you know when is it just kind of the flood of information for misregulation? If curiosity is not behind, like trying to uncover I don't know, try to understand how Congress passes a bill, but instead watching just political debates on cable news. Is there some sort of line with misregulation where it moves from, oh, I'm just really curious about this and I want to learn more, to being dysfunctional?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say that, like, what exactly that line would be, but certainly people that are drawn for information, they probably don't have that same sense that it's like emotionally driven, right? They're probably trying to get informed. They're probably trying to learn about things because they have this rational process where they're thinking about the importance of it. But we think in particular, fear and anxiety are the emotions that are the strongest drivers here. And we just have as people in general have a natural propensity to pay attention to negative information, right? And one of the main
Yeah.
reasons is we want to know about threats, right? We want to be aware if there's something concerning that we need to know about. It's just kind of a natural tendency we have. And so those kind of threatening stories can get really, enticing to people. And so they want to learn more. They want to understand what's going on. And that really draws them in. But the problem is it is kind of this loop that you can't ever get out of, because if you follow the news, right, especially the last few years, there's never an end to the kind of negative threatening
Totally.
you might run into. And usually it's not resolved anytime soon. So it's just kind of this constantly chasing this resolution or this feeling of comfort that just doesn't usually come.
Even as a journalist, I would say, I've looked, at the news, worked in the news in some capacity for almost 20 years now. I mean, the last several years have been a news cycle that I've never seen before. And whether or not that's partly because the role of the news media has changed, I think is an interesting conversation. But we've also had just a series of stories that any given year, maybe you have, it's like 2 or 3 big hurricanes, maybe every given year you have 2 or 3 really big news stories, and they kind of come and you deal with them and they pass. And that has not been the case over the last several years. It's been one storm after the next, and sometimes multiple at the same time. So finally, what's interference? How did you define interference?
That's when kind of you start to see the problem bleeding into other aspects of your life. When you can't stop thinking about the news, you can't stop checking it. It might affect other things you're doing. So interference, we're referring to just being able to kind of be focused on your family life, work or school, ability to sleep. And when you can't kind of connect to that stuff because you're too busy thinking about or checking the news, it can kind of disrupt your daily flow. It can kind of lead you to not appreciating the moments in the here and now that you might otherwise have. You might think about somebody who's checking the news at the dinner table with their family, or constantly checking the news instead of focusing at work, and just kind of
I'm covering myself, and in case you're listening, I'm like, oh, I might be guilty of that, but it's my work too. It's my passion. So, but I'm totally willing to have Professor McLaughlin diagnose me with problematic news consumption, which is probably true. Sorry, but as you were saying, it could interfere. Your desire to consume the news is interfering with your daily life.
yeah, correct.
Okay, so now you have these definitions. How do you go about even finding a group of people to see if, number one, they have problematic news consumption, and number two, if it's actually leading to mental or physical ill-being, as you call it?
Yeah. So we conducted a survey with a national sample of 1,100 Americans. Really, and at this point, the survey was the easiest way to do it. Kind of just get a sense and get a large range of people and see kind of what this looks like. With the problem with the surveys, we can only like establish correlations. We can see that things are related, but we can't necessarily say this is definitely causing this. But we did find a good portion of people that kind of classified as high on all the criteria. In our sample is 16.5%, which is a pretty sizable chunk, right?
So
And then
that's the percentage that through their own sort of filling out the survey, being asked questions, you would define as problematic news consumers.
right. And so there was
Okay.
a gap between like kind of this group and the other groups in terms of how they're scoring and also the outcomes. But they were scoring high in all the measures, right? All the kind of indications they were, fully absorbed. They were kind of doing it all the time. It was interfering with their life. Just kind of people that checked high on all those boxes, we kind of were able to group them. And we found that they scored also a lot higher, like significantly higher than everybody else on mental health. And this is generalized stress and anxiety. So not stress and anxiety about the news specifically, but things about like kind of feeling anxious all the time or feeling close to a panic. So just kind of this constant feelings of stress and anxiety that aren't specific about the news. And then also physical ill-being, things like sore backs, headaches, digestive issues, neck pain, trouble sleeping, all those type of elements as well. And we really found that this group was substantially distinguished from these other groups. And we also did include controls for overall news use. So this isn't just about the amount of news you consume, because we kind of accounted for that in our analysis, as well as personality traits such as neuroticism. So people who have higher levels of neuroticism tended to have these outcomes, but we kind of take that into account. So what we're finding is over and above being neurotic will lead to these, or is at least related to these outcomes.
Okay, I think that was one of the questions that I actually wrote down because I was curious, is it true that as we're looking at correlation, so problematic news consumption, this group had a higher ranking of these mental and physical issues, but could it be that people with these mental and physical issues already become problematic news consumers? Meaning, is there a profile that then makes them more likely to consume the news, or is it the news consumption that is leading back? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, controlling for neuroticism helps say that there's something more going on than that, but certainly
Mhm.
we don't think this is like a one-way direction, one-way path. That it's just if you're problematic, then you have these outcomes. People that tend to be stressed and anxious all the time are probably also the type of people that are going to be hyper focused on things that they find threatening and get really absorbed in it. But we would also expect that then makes their outcomes worse, right? So if you're stressed all the time and you consume a lot of news that's stressful, we would expect it kind of to make the cycle worse, to have more stress that you're carrying around. So even if it is cyclical, we do think that kind of having this relationship with the news can make things worse, even if you started off in a bad place.
Professor McLaughlin, is the news making us sick?
For some people, I think it is. I mean, there's certainly, as you mentioned, there are a lot of things, right, that we can point to that are causing issues, following Instagram too closely, whatever it might be. But for certain people, I do think that getting way too caught up in the news and taking it, getting too stressful, having too much stress about it, does negatively impact your kind of your livelihood, your quality of life.
So what do they do about it? You talk about this in some of the kind of this discussion of your research, because even you said at the beginning, taking a break from the news, cool. Everyone can take a break and usually it feels pretty good, but then you kind of want to go back. So turning things off completely also isn't feasible because you mentioned kind of the social ramifications to it. So what do you think about that? What changes a problematic news consumer to one that's not?
Right. I mean, it's probably a long process to kind of get to a healthy relationship with the news. But yeah, we don't want people to stop watching the news, right? As you mentioned, the news is really important for a society. It has a lot of important information. It has a lot of important personal information, right? You might need to know things. You might need to know things about your community, things that might be important for your health, just keeping up with things. But it's good for kind of our society or our civic duty to kind of be informed, to have a sense. to be able to participate in kind of political participation and voting and all this stuff, that you need to be informed to do, have kind of informed opinions. So there's a lot of important functions that we need it for. And going cold turkey is problematic in that front, but also it probably doesn't work if you go back to your old ways, right? And a lot of people that just try to quit cold turkey might eventually find themselves right back in the same cycle, right? So we think there are a couple of things that people can kind of do. Well, the first is just having awareness of this should help, right? Being more aware of what your habits look like is important, because a lot of this is just so habitual, is so second nature, that people don't even kind of realize the extent of it, right? You're not kind of necessarily always thinking, okay, I should look at the news for this reason or that reason, right? You just, it's part of your routine, and you just could jump right back into it. And so you're probably doing it more than you need to. And so that kind of, just being aware of that might help you kind of be able to better regulate your patterns, but also being more aware of how it's affecting you, of kind of just observing and paying attention to how you're feeling the moment and thinking, okay, I'm a little anxious, I'm turning the news, paying attention. Does that help you, or does it make you feel a little bit worse? And if it's making you feel worse, just kind of being more aware of that can be a motivating factor for people to kind of start paying attention to when they're doing it, and maybe be a little bit more selective in that regard.
I mean, it's just so much of what you're saying is resonating with me as a consumer, but also as a business person, because having participated in the 24-hour news cycle on cable news and seeing that from the inside was one of the reasons why I started a different news platform, with the hope that, I think it was actually, to be honest with you, Professor McLaughlin, I think it was actually both ways. Like I definitely saw a need that we could be more productive and helpful as journalists to the American public, to the broader public. Doesn't even have to. We have a lot of international people that watch us on Smarter News. But also, I knew that in order to be a really good journalist, being on constantly wasn't actually the best way to do that. It wasn't actually the highest value that I could do, even though for a lot of reasons it was fun, it was exciting. You got to do breaking news. I can't help but think we're actually speaking, ironically, on the week we were looking into this in Smarter News. It's the week that the first papers were published in America, the first like daily newspapers were published in America. And we were looking into this because we were trying to think of a way that we could cover it. And, there's so much going on with the news cycle that I don't know if we're going to be able to do it this year. But I'm thinking back to even a few decades ago when people were just getting the news, their daily paper would come in the morning or in the evening. They would have the radio, but it wasn't the news environment that it is right now. And so is it the consumer that is problematic, or is it the news industry that's actually problematic? That's the question that I arrive at.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both, right? And I think, I mean, part of it's the news industry, and part of it's just the advances in technology, right? The accessibility of
Absolutely.
social media just makes it so much easier to get sucked in all the time, right? It's right there. You don't have to turn on the TV. You can be somewhere where you really should just be focusing on what you're doing, not checking your phone, but there it is. And so you're back into it, right? And so that's part of it. But of course, right, especially with, the way things have gone and the more partisan outlets, and there's just so much focus on these kind of negative aspects that really just kind of seems to ramp up the stakes. And, everybody seems to be, a threatening villain that you have to pay attention to. And it's, it sells, right? It's a marketplace,
It
and the
does.
news wants viewers, and threatening information, concerning information is going to draw more people in and make them feel like they have to keep checking. So it's, it's a business model that makes sense. But in terms of the benefits for society, there comes to be some questions when they're doing things based on kind of calculations on, is this going to get more viewers versus is it going to inform viewers? But, that's, we don't really have background on, news production. So what to do about
Well,
that?
I'm ready. If you need me to step in, Professor McLaughlin, for
Yeah.
your next big research, I'm ready to turn myself over to science, whatever you need to talk about how that's actually done. Your point about technology, I think, is really important too, because it's easy, any big industry, it's easy to kind of gang up on, and it's easy to be negative about technology. I get frustrated with Instagram, for example. But I also like walking around TJ Maxx, listening to a foreign policy podcast from, any news outlet. And that sounds like something totally random. How could I be doing like basically shopping and then listening to the news, but technology allows me to do that. And it's actually great. It's one of I love taking a walk and listening to different things that I wouldn't have had access to before. Or you're able to source things, for example, you'd have governments that maybe the United States doesn't have diplomatic relations with, but I can find direct quotes from them because they're on social media. And that actually, I think, is important for people to get that instant access. So it is really a double-edged sword. I just wanted to read this last line of one of your discussion pieces here on the study, because I think our audience will really appreciate it. You were talking about just the lead up to this, about how turning off the news completely is not the solution, nor something that you're advocating for. Thus, the results of our study emphasize that the commercial pressures that news media face are not just harmful to the goal of maintaining a healthy democracy, they also may be harmful to individual health. And that really just maps out the stakes. So what do you think are the stakes here? And where do you want your research to go next?
Well, for us, like I was saying, we're more focused on what individuals can do, because that's more, we have better understanding of, how things affect people and kind of things of that nature. So certainly it would be great to have a conversation. And the fact that there are outlets like yours kind of trying to kind of find a better solution is fantastic. And so it's great to see that. And it's great to kind of have people that have that interest in these type of kind of more balanced, more focused news stories that aren't meant to draw you in, right, and take you away from your daily life. In terms of kind of what people can do, we are now kind of focused on thinking about some solutions. We want to study kind of potentially how mindfulness might help, right? So one of the things we think is that people tend to get drawn into these narratives and they get sucked away from their daily life, right? But people can develop, through mindfulness training, which is very accessible and kind of easy to do. We think that people can, if they can get more grounded and get better at just paying attention to what's going on around them, being there with your family, being absorbed in your work or your schoolwork, whatever it might be, and just appreciating what's going on, that will actually decrease the stress you're feeling from the news, because you're not carrying it around with you, right? You're able to disassociate it from it. You're able to put it aside and say, I don't really need to worry about this at this present time, right? There might be times that, the threats in the news do become real and present for you, and then you can deal with them then, but you don't have to always carry it around, right? Just because you can think about it and just because you can tap in and pay attention to it, there are times that you can also focus on what's going around, pay attention to the other things that are going on in your life, the more directly immediate stuff. And we think that doing that will help people, both probably not have as bad as habits, but if they are, kind of have a better management of them. So that's something we want to kind of look at, kind of do some experiments and see if putting people in intervention campaigns might help.
I love that idea. I think that sounds awesome and really interesting to even think about now, how to be more mindful. So then when you want to focus on the news or there's a big news story, there's some more balance in your life. Quick question about your survey. Did you look at whether or not people were consuming partisan news sources? Was there a dividing line, or did you even look at if there was more conservative outlets or more liberal outlets that they were more aligned with?
Yeah, so that's actually something we're going to look at further. That's another follow-up study we want to do. We do have measures for conservative, liberal, mainstream, search engine aggregates, stuff like that, but we kind of just group them all together. Our first step is kind of looking at that. What we want to do next is kind of have a more fine-grained approach, and kind of look at both the types of outlets that might be affecting this, as well as the type of news stories, right? Not all news stories are going to get people super stressed out. People that are really into celebrity gossip probably aren't going to have the same type of outcomes as people that are into political news, right? But certainly other things like, you get too caught up in sports, that can be pretty stressful too.
Speaking from Texas, you understand this. I mean, even just saying Texas Tech, I might have people have a visceral reaction to you, depending on what school they're in, or more aligned with. Absolutely. With that news topic, so two quick follow-up questions to that. Did you, on the partisan side and going further down that route, if people were not classified as fully problematic news consumers? If they were just like sort of problematic news consumers, did they also have some mental or physical ill-being, like the ones that would be classified as such?
Yeah, so we actually we group people like in four groups based on kind of analysis, seeing like how people tended to cluster together on scores. And so we had that one group, the very high group, which is the high across the board. The next group was a moderate group where they kind of scored moderately. So somewhat absorbed, somewhat compulsive, some interference, and they did have higher levels of mental and physical ill-being than the other two groups, which were kind of lower. But there's still a stark difference between them and the severely problematic group, and that difference was much bigger than the one between that next group and the other groups. And then there's a second group of people that would get a little absorbed, but then they were able to kind of step away, right? So that when they were
Mm.
paying attention, they might get sucked in, but then they were able to kind of not be compulsive and not have it interfere. And we didn't really see any, negative outcomes for them. And then another group that just wasn't into the news at all.
I don't know what that feels like. So I'm curious about that group. Like, what does that feel like to just be like, I'm good. I want to finish up here just with like a little bit of it's not a juxtaposition, that's not the right word, but maybe a little bit of a contrarian thought about the news. We're coming out of a news cycle where we've been covering the Queen's funeral, Queen Elizabeth II. And that was a real moment, big news story. But there was a moment where it felt like the news almost could work. Instead of making people feel more aggravated at each other, the honor of this particular figure's life and the way that so many that are very different just sort of felt sad about the event or felt a certain sense of mourning, and then saw that reflected back to them on the television screen or through social media. In some ways, it sort of felt, and this is my opinion on it, so I'm sure there's others that have different ones, almost like a unifying event, that it was a moment where humanity could actually connect through the news, which isn't always the case with the news. And so I'm just kind of curious, just your thoughts on that. I mean, I know that's not directly related to your study, but also the possibility that news, depending on the story and maybe how it's also delivered, it's a very different news delivery of a funeral than a political debate, can actually help us connect and feel less bad because we're actually connecting in a way that we wouldn't otherwise have the chance to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the potential is obviously there. Now, how realistic it is, given the current state of affairs, for this to be, a lasting thing, who knows? But people tend to have, altruistic tendencies, and we tend to want social connection. We're social beings, and so having connection and having kind of shared experiences is an important thing we have. The problem is we tend to do that now in groups in opposition to other groups.
Yeah.
Um, but and I'm not old enough to remember what it was like when there was only 5 channels on TV.
Mhm.
But it seems like there was a time that people would share experiences as a nation and kind of unify around it in a way that now, when there's something that seems like maybe potentially could be unifying, it becomes divisive. So I think the potential is there, and you set an example that we can put aside differences and just kind of focus on this shared experience and things of that nature. So yeah, I think the potential is there. Now, how realistic it is, is that being a common occurrence? I'm a little more skeptical about that, but
Right.
uh,
Yeah. Well, it was also a historic event and someone that lived 96 years. So you're right. For another figure to come around like that, it is a rare event. That is absolutely true. How, just as we finish up, how has this changed your life? So you've done the research, you already felt something about the news. Now you actually see the research, you were looking at it. Has this changed the way that you consume news further?
I don't know that it's changed that much, because I kind of came to these realizations before I went down this path. I mean, I think I'm maybe like more committed to trying to figure out how to be more active in my news consumption and be more engaged at this point, rather than just trying to tune out, which as I mentioned, I went through that process, and so I'm kind of more in the recovery stage, right? And so I think I'm kind of focused on this idea that it is important to figure out ways to be a good citizen and to be engaged and be connected. And so I think maybe that's made me think about that a little bit more. But I think I've gotten to the point where I'm not too sucked into the news, and I do realize when it's becoming a problem for me, and I say, okay, maybe just take a little break from the story for now.
Yeah, but hopefully we all have that wisdom. I think that term news consumer, I've been thinking a lot about it in relation to Smarter News and a couple projects that we're launching, because it instantly makes you feel like you're passive, right? Like you're consuming the news. This is just happening to you and it's consuming, and the onslaught of the avalanche of news is just too much. When really the news is important because it's the story of our lives. This is the story of the era that we're living in, that we actually play a part in. We're not consumers, we're participants in this storyline. And I think it's really important to talk to the audience that way. There's always an audience, but they're not just passive consumers, they're part of it. And I think that's really important for journalists to think about. All right, Professor McLaughlin, this has been great. I know you have a lot of work to do. I really want to reiterate that though. If you need a survey done and you want access to some news consumers from a lot of different political backgrounds, from all over the United States, use Smarter News. We're here for you, and we can toss out some online surveys. Let's get this next stage going. I think it's amazing work, and I'm so glad you're doing it and actually putting some scientific analysis to something that people talk about all the time, and it's actually here in the data. So just want to make sure you know that we're ready to assist, and we really appreciate the time with you today.
I appreciate having me. It was great talking to you.
Thank you so much.